we do need, they need the special kind of entitlements of special ed law to protect them. But many students just kind of needed more targeted support, and they didn't necessarily need to be kind of entered into a system that they may not fit. And so it was so important that we kind of set up a different infrastructure so that and I can kind of say, as a parent of two sons, if my child is struggling, do they have access to, potentially have access to every resource they need within the school division, like, without having to go through a legal process of being labeled with a disability? Again, especially if not, they may not have an education disability. They might need to be taught in a more different or a more targeted way. And so that is one of the foundational pieces of the Virginia Tier system of support. The other piece of that is, the key word is system, because what we need to do is we need to, and it kind of sounds bureaucratic. It's like, oh, okay, we need a we need to kind of take a systematic approach to this. What that really means is that if it doesn't matter what school my child goes to, if they go to any one of our elementary schools, if they walk on the door, the quality of the instruction and the quality of the intervention they get shouldn't be just a random kind of lottery of which teacher they happen to get or which reading specialist that building but particularly happened to have. And for many, many years, it was that. And it led to many, many inequities, disproportionate identification of our Black and brown students for special education, and many disproportionate discipline referrals because they weren't, basically kids weren't being successful in the system that we set up. And many times the system was set up for adult needs. It wasn't set up for student needs. So the Virginia Tier system of supports is so important because it hopefully kind of raises the floor, so it doesn't matter what school you walk into, it doesn't matter what teacher you have, we're going to raise that floor, and you're going to get a high a high basement of instruction. Some teachers will be more effective in certain areas than others, but everyone is to get a very high quality education, and that is our goal, and that is what hopefully we set this up to do. Now, we talk about in different systems here, but we talk about what do we have, or what are those kind of different domains that are supported. And depending on where you are in Virginia, again, the big concept is called multi-tier system of supports. That concept is all over the country. Virginia has their own particular model where they talk about mostly about literacy and math. They talk about behavior, and they talk about, and just lately, and again, Charlottesville was one of the first school divisions to do this. They talk about mental health or mental wellness, and we'll talk more about that a little later. We also talk about the fact that student and family engagement is something that has tiers, and that all these things are, and again, like we talk about here, tier 1 is what we do for all students and families. And then what we've learned also is that our staff also need tiered support. And so tier 1 is what we do for every student, what we do for all staff members. This is what everybody gets as you enroll in Charlottesville City Schools. This is what you get in these particular areas. Tier 2 would be if you weren't quite as successful as you wanted to be, and again, and you've kind of fell within the bottom 20% of your grade, kind of compared to your peers in a particular area. What kind of support can you get? And so that might be, again, targeted for small groups. And then tier 3 would be, what kind of individualized, more intensive support do you need? And this is kind of a fluid process. And the idea of it is that you don't get identified and that you're tier 3 for life. It's supposed to be set up a system of just-in-time support, that as we find out that you're falling a little bit behind, we don't wait. We first make sure that you're getting quality, good first instruction. But for whatever reason, if your needs kind of exceed the ability of the classroom teacher to meet, and they've done everything that we expect of our classroom teachers to do, then what additional supports do your school have for reading, for math, for mental wellness, for behavior support? And then, and again, if there are barriers for, is a student having some difficulty engaging in school? And so, okay, but like let me go kind of back to the other side. We used to talk about attendance as a domain, but attendance is such a limited term. We really think that attendance is really an indicator of, is a student engaged in school? Has a school engaged with a student and with their families? And if they're not engaged, what can we do to remove the barriers to get them more engaged? And how can we change our system to make them feel like they're more connected to us? And so this system is available to every single student in Charlottesville City Schools. It's available to every staff member in Charlottesville City Schools. And again, that's our ideal. And we're not quite where we want to be with that. We are continually working toward that. And so in this, and folks, I just to kind of give you some nuts and bolts, I see my slide and I don't see your questions. So if you're in the chat, if you have a question, either Bianca can kind of point it out to me, or we're a small group, just shout it out. I'll stop, stop sharing. We'll answer the question, we'll move forward. Or you can kind of wait till the end. Either one's fine with me. Because again, I like this to be a conversation, because you might have specific questions. And so that's all fine. And so I think the key thing with Virginia Tier System of Support is that different from our old system. Again, our old system was predicated on the fact that there's something wrong with the child. And of course, the data shows us that, in many circumstances, historically, what was wrong with the child is they just happened to be born with the wrong color skin, which is a horrible thing to get stigmatized and to get a different kind of education before that. So for us, we need to change that perspective. What are we doing as a school system to make sure that your child is being successful? And so we want to talk about how do we know that we're delivering good first instruction? If I just go strictly on the basis of everyone in this class who did not pass the reading benchmark needs to go to intervention. Well, if I have 3 kids and you think, oh, well, there's 3 kids there out of 20, that seems about, right. We would just, again, look at the bell curve. Some kids might struggle more than others. Those kids might need intervention. But if you have a class of 20 and 17 of them are not meeting benchmark, that's not necessarily a kid issue. That's what we call a system issue. So look at number 4. That's a question we want school teams to continually ask themselves. Is it a system issue or is it a kid issue? And then the other piece of this is the reason why we have tiered systems of support. Historically, if you struggled in math, we had a team sat down that just looked at math. If you struggled in literacy, a team sat down that just looked at literacy. And we know now that there's many reasons why a student might struggle, and it might evidence itself across multiple domains. A student who's taking and failing math literacy benchmarks may not have a disability in math or reading. It could be they're homeless and they've slept maybe 2 hours over the last week and they're exhausted and they can barely be present at school, and that's why they're failing. And so we need to have the people who understand the data well enough to understand the difference and saying, let's triage this. What is the primary reason for why this student is struggling right now? Let's do that. And then once we kind of get that hopefully addressed, we could address other areas where they might be running a deficit. So again, it's a different way of schools of operating than we have historically. So hopefully it's more of a preventative approach. Identify those who need support as early as possible. Again, one of the old kind of criticism, and very legitimate, was of identifying a student with a learning disability. It's like, well, we can't identify them for special education until they've failed enough that we know that they're struggling. I'm like, no, that's a horrible thing for the students. It's a horrible thing for families, and it wasn't successful. Let's be preventative and proactive as much as we possibly can be. Let's identify those kids who need support as early as possible. Let's identify those teachers who need support as early as possible. And then let's try to be, again, proactive and reduce, again, all the barriers that are out there to making people not being successful as they want to be. So let me stop right here and kind of go through the tiers here. So what we call tier 1 is what everybody gets. This is the core instruction that you go in there, you're just your typical child who walks through the door at one of our schools, and this is what you get. And so for us, again, these are kind of evidence-based practices that are demonstrated that we would expect that 80 to 90% of our students will be able to meet these expectations that we put on them. And so that's a way of measuring, do we have good instruction? So our first question is, what are we expecting all students to learn? Again, a little different from what we might have done in the past. We're not going to assume that if a student is struggling in first instruction, that it's automatically a kid issue. It's like, maybe we're not kind of talking to different learning modalities. Maybe we're not kind of teaching in a culturally responsive way. There might be changes we need to make in the instruction, again, to meet all kids' needs. Tier 2, the idea is, okay, you might just need a little more extra help with what we did the first time around. And so the idea is that 20% or less of students should be receiving supplemental instruction. Again, think about those 5 domains we talked about before. We talked about literacy, we talked about math, positive behavior support, how they're functioning behaviorally, mental health we talk about, And then are they engaged in school? And one of those indicators is attendance, but it could also be truancy. Are they a student that every time during fifth period, which happens to be math, they go to the nurse's office? Or you know, are they really struggling with peer relations? And so thinking about who needs that extra support moving forward. And then we have to think about, okay, so then what do we do to impact those students? And the key thing that we have to ask ourselves is what we're doing being effective. Again, asking the question, if it's effective, then it should work for most of the kids because we're giving them, usually tier 2 is like you're talking about a small group, anywhere from like say 3 to 8 kids. They're being taught in a much more intensive way. We're taking data more intensively. And so with all that extra help, you'd expect of these students to get some good gains. And so ideally, if we do those interventions, 70 to 80% of those kids should improve their performance and close that gap between them and their peers. But if we don't do that, then we have to ask ourselves, is this intervention? Are we doing the right intervention, and are we doing the intervention right? And so again, I'm giving you some of the also like kind of the teacher perspectives, just so you, when you have these conversations with your child's teacher, you have a little kind of background, a little perspective as to where they might be coming from. And again, I think many times when communication breaks down between school and parents and school and the community, it's we're talking past each other a little bit. We might be talking about some different conversations. And so we want to make sure we don't do that. And then if a student, yes, is there a question?
Yeah, so there isn't a question, but just in case families aren't aware, when you say intervention, can you explain a little bit what that means?
Yes, thank you, Bianca. So let me go back to the other side. So intervention is so what we want to make sure everyone will continue to get their core basic instruction. Intervention is what's done on top of that. And so it could be that a team may decide, you know what, rather than during a class period, we have whole class instruction, and then we have kind of independent work. And so for some students, they might just kind of choose to work independently and apply the lessons they've learned. Other students need more support. And so they might have a specific target intervention during that non-independent time. And so that could be what happened within the classroom. It could be that there's a specialist who might come and work with a small group outside the classroom. And again, that's something that's hopefully made in consultation with the parents. But that is supplemental on top of tier 1. And so on top of their instruction, it should not be instead of it. And again, sometimes we fall short of that. And so if you feel like, wait a minute, are you pulling my child from math class to give them math intervention? Talk to me about that, because they need to be getting their instruction. I understand they might need some extra help. And so, but the idea is this is on top of the delivery of the core instruction. Thank you, Bianca. That's a great clarification, because it's really important to know, and it's something that school systems across the country have failed at sometimes. They think, oh, the student is not doing well in math. Well, let's take them out of this math class and just put them with a math tutor for 8 hours a day. And that doesn't necessarily, that's kind of wrong in 2 different ways. It doesn't necessarily help the student because they're not getting the same instruction their peers are. And it also doesn't help the teacher, because if they're doing something wrong, we're kind of letting them off the hook and saying, you keep on doing that wrong thing. Anyone who struggles with that, we'll put them with a math tutor. And so for us, it's like, no, interventions are on top of regular good instruction. Okay, thank you, Bianca. And then the last piece is tier 3, intensive individualized instruction, where this is, again, the intervention is a lot more targeted. And hopefully we'll only talk about 0 to 5% of our students. In complete transparency this year, that percentage is higher, especially when we're dealing with mental health. That, typically speaking, we talk about an inverted triangle. We know that many more of our students than 5% are struggling with their mental health. And that's true in Charlottesville, that's true across the country. And so sometimes you might hear that like a newspaper article might talk about an inverted triangle. Because obviously, when we talk about these tiered systems of support, there's always this triangle model. And what that means is that most of the kids are going to be in the bottom of the triangle. Only a few kids are on the top. This year, we've struggled a little bit where basically that triangle is upside down. There's many kids who are struggling, who need intensive support. And again, we're trying to do the best job that we possibly can with that. And so again, we have that same criteria with the intervention, that these interventions typically they could be daily, they could be individualized, so you might be in a group of 1 to 3. And you're also kind of taking data each week, as opposed to like waiting every month. It's like each week or daily, if it has to do with kind of behavior or mental health support. Are we impacting? Is a student increasing their skill level? Are they and again, not necessarily are they on grade level, but is because of the intervention, are they closing the gap between them and their peers? And that's a question that teams should be asking themselves all the time. The other piece it's very important to realize is that different kids struggle with different things at different times during their academic career. It's a very typical phenomena that many kids who are bright but have a learning disability, they might do just fine kindergarten through third grade. Because again, they have so many good adaptive skills. They have some great support at home, that they just make it, they make it kind of just keep on giving you a good look, and they think, oh no, they're doing fine. They're doing fine. But as we know, and especially when going to third to fourth grade, there's a jump in both the pace of instruction and the amount of instruction. So as opposed to you kind of expecting to know a small amount, all of a sudden that increases dramatically. And then for many kids, those compensatory strategies they're using just aren't enough. And so then they all of a sudden, for the first time, they may start to struggle. And so we see that sometimes. Sometimes we see it middle school, sometimes we see it at high school, sometimes we see it catch it early on. But the idea of this too is that every student has strengths and weaknesses, and they kind of show themselves at different times in their academic career. And it's this idea of, if someone needs intervention and tiered support, that's a fluid thing. It's like they might need it for a little while, they get some good help, they come back down, and then maybe something else will pop up later. And so for us, the key thing with that is the school system needs to be flexible enough to meet their changing needs, and need to kind of be looking for the data to know that the student now is being successful in this, but maybe not as successful in that. And so that's really important. So that's kind of the basic rundown of the tiered system supports for all domains. What I want to get into a little right now is some things that you may not know, and again, may not exist really when you and I went to school, is what supports do we have for what we call positive school culture and mental wellness. So let me kind of tackle the first one. So we have many great initiatives in our school, and you might hear some of these things. You might hear them at an assembly. You might read them in the newspaper, and there's all these acronyms. And so things like, we talk about equity, we talk about being trauma responsive. There's a program called Responsive Classroom. We're going to talk a little bit about PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, as a system. We talk a lot, and again, that's one of the initiatives that I lead in our division. SEL, social emotional learning. You hear things like mindfulness, restorative practices, all these things on the left-hand side there. And it gets overwhelming for people. I mean, I'm sure it gets overwhelming to parents. It gets overwhelming for teachers. They think, I teach reading. I'm supposed to know all this stuff on the left-hand side and teach reading? Like, that's too much. And so what we know is it's really important that both families, students, and teachers and staff have clarity. They understand what is it we're doing. It's integrated. It kind of, we don't have redundant systems that address the same thing and be redundant. Transparency, everyone kind of sees what's going on when there's no kind of hidden agendas, and then we're building our capacity to do those things. And so for us, what we're going for, these are all kind of programs, but we're going for this. What we're trying to create for all of our students and staff, this is what we consider that is made up of Charlottesville City Schools positive school culture. Are we improving adult and student social emotional competencies? And so when I say competencies, that's different than just saying skills, because skills is something that I can kind of learn in isolation, but I had difficulty applying them across different settings. So competencies means I not only understand what the skill is, but I can apply it with different situations and with different people. That's true for students. That's true for adults. Because historically, we know that we've had some adults who have difficulty applying some skills in with certain student situations. And again, the idea is not to blame, is to give them support and to increase their skills. Are we creating and sustaining safe and equitable school environments? Okay, we've had it, obviously last year, we had a big point of conversation in our school division on school safety, the whole conversation about school resource officers. And so if we're not going to have, what are we doing proactively to create a safe place for students, for staff, and a belief in the community that the schools are a safe place to send their children? And are those environments equitable? Is, again, like what I talked about at the very beginning, if I send my child to school, it's not going to be a luck of the draw whether they get good mental health support just because they went to school A versus school B. That we know that they're going to get at least solid support, and it could be incredible support. And the last one is intentionally building connected communities, because we know that when things go well, and as a former teacher myself, you talk about having those great classes. It's when you kind of feel interiorly connected and warm and inviting. You go into those classrooms and they feel like places you want to be. And before, I think we thought that was kind of random. Like, well, some teachers can do that, some teachers can't. And that's just kind of it's like, no, we've learned that you can intentionally build that. And you have to be kind of very intentional about how you kind of create those structures in the schools. How do you support the teachers and get trained to do that? And then how do you give the students voice so their voices are heard in those communities? And so all those things, all those programs I showed you before on the left-hand side, they should be building to one or all of these things right here. So going back to, again, we used to call out the kind of the top puzzle piece, we used to call that attendance. Now it's student family engagement. We talk about mental wellness. Mental wellness is, what are the things we want all of our students and staff to be able to do and have? Not mental health, whereas when things go wrong, because that's the kind of connotation with that, but what are we doing to proactively build mental wellness? And then how are we intentionally creating positive school culture and not just talking about behavior? Because you talk about behavior, it's like, well, this is what the adults are labeling some students as not conforming or not complying with the rules that they've set up. And so we know that sometimes those rules were inequitable. And so it's a little subtle change, but it's a really important piece that what we're trying to do a little differently here in Charlottesville City Schools. So as a parent or as a community member, to ask those questions, these are very legitimate questions to be asking your school. Is my child successful? How do I know? And then ask, if not, what are we doing differently? If needed, how is additional help can be provided? And you have the right to the answers to all these questions. And that's what I meant before about transparency. What can I do to be involved in problem solving? Again, if a school team is meeting together to talk about my student, how do I know about that? And how is that communicated to me? What can I do to help with the intervention of my child at home? And then really importantly, how will I know if the interventions are working? And you should feel like you're not in a kind of just waiting to hear. I didn't hear from my teacher. I didn't hear from the interventionist. You should feel, and the school division has a responsibility to make it feel like we're doing with you, not to you or even for you, but with you. And so that's really, really important. And then again, if you those are more generalized questions, but at this moment in time right now, what do I do if I believe my child is struggling? These are some very basic things you can do. Again, talk with the teacher, ask for a regular progress report. And many times when, especially our younger teachers, or sometimes even our older teachers, we kind of revert to educational jargon. Well, they didn't meet the benchmarks on this SO and this formative assessment. You're like, well, what does that mean? I mean, our teachers shouldn't do that, but again, they don't necessarily kind of mean kind of anything bad like that. But sometimes we get a little defensive and we kind of revert into our jargon. Feel free to stop and saying, I don't understand what you just told me. Can you kind of tell me that again in a way that I might understand? And again, it's just asking a clarifying question. And we want everyone to be on the same page. And that's when, again, true effective collaboration is happening, is when we're hearing you and you're hearing us, and we're both acting on that. And then again, just feel free to ask those specific questions about your students' progress. Like I referred to before, it's really important that there's a team set up at school to have, again, those systems support, to have that multidisciplinary lens. I often give the example when I was, for a long time, I worked in special education. And we had a system of intervention set up where if a child was struggling in reading, then they got reading intervention. And so there's one child was struggling reading, they got in reading comprehension, so they got intervention for reading comprehension. They continue to struggle. Well, then they went from tier 2 to tier 3. So as far as being a part of a group, now they were being met one-on-one with a reading specialist, and we were pounding away at reading comprehension, and they weren't doing well. And I'm like, oh, well, we need to go to special education and find out what their disability is. And then we go through a special education evaluation. We find out the child met the criteria for a student with autism. And that was not in the intervention team's kind of purview at all. That came out through testing, from the school psychologist and through various observations. And so, like we said here, if all you think is like, oh, if there's a reading problem, then I need to apply reading solutions to it. It's like the old hammer to a nail. If all you have is a hammer, everything appears like a nail here. And so for us, it's really important that we kind of have that aligned view, that we're thinking about attendance, we're thinking about mental health, we're thinking about all the reasons why there could be barriers for a student succeeding in school, and then try to triage, okay, given what we know, given the parents' input, given the students' input, and given the data we have, what's the best way we should approach this? One thing that we, it was kind of a bit revolutionary when we started this about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think a lot of people have come on now, is realizing the impact that mental health had on academic achievement. Um, that these things were very intertwined, that if a student is struggling with their mental health, they're not going to be available for instruction, and therefore they will struggle academically. But the key thing we need to understand, it took a while for us to understand, is academic interventions are only going to be of a limited impact if we don't address the underlying issues of either mental health or mental wellness, or sometimes it was a case of student engagement. But again, many times it's both those things. So it's having that kind of, it gets more complex, but it's having that integrated lens. And so for us, we had to set up structures in our school to address all of these things. So that's what kind of led us to get into social emotional learning. So what does mental wellness tier 1 is basically, as opposed to kind of, kids who would walk through the door and they seem to regulate their own behavior pretty well. They seemed aware of what emotions they had. They were able to interact with their peers in an effective way. They seem to make good decisions, and they seem to have a lot of friends. And so we said that for a long time, we thought, well, that's something you either have or you didn't have. And now we know that those are skills and competencies that could be explicitly taught. And in fact, we had an obligation to teach them because, again, we know that they're the underpinning many times of academic learning, that it's not an either or thing, it's an and thing. And that's the phrase we use a lot. Don't say it's either mental wellness or academics, because in schools, a lot of times we compete for time. It's an and thing. If both those needs are being met, each one will help the other. And so we started about 5 or 6 years ago, setting up our social emotional learning system. It started at elementary, and right now we can kind of say in some capacity, and again, having COVID has impacted this a little bit, there is social emotional learning happening in all of our school settings, K-12, and which is, again, really important. The other piece that we really discovered, as we said, okay, well, let's make sure we teach the students these skills. We need to have that lens on, do the teachers themselves have these competencies? And not in a negative way, but like, are we doing enough to support the teachers to be able to deal with everything that they have to do with, both personally and also with every kid that walks through their door? Because we know that if you look at this kind of slide here, the social interactions that teachers have with students and the instructional interactions have a wide variety of impacts. And so it really kind of lets us know how important it is that the teacher-student relationship is set up to be positive and successful. And maybe that was a lens that we didn't always have before. We thought, oh, it was more about compliance. Like students should do what the teachers say. But again, if a teacher struggles themselves socio-emotionally, then they're gonna have a harder time being the best support to those students. So we need to help both of them. And so that's an important thing. And so this comes to that slide. We'll come to realize with many of our initiatives that kids can't be well unless the adults are well. And we need to think not just about one, but about both of them. And so that's a really a point of emphasis, both for our professional learning and for the various support systems that we've set up. So I'm not going to read all these things to you. These are all the different things that are going on in our schools this year regarding mental wellness and positive school culture initiatives. You might have heard of some of these things at faculty meetings, and I'm happy to speak to any one of these if you have more questions, but just know there's a lot of them. And that's kind of led to that slide I showed you before about all those things on the left-hand side. Are we going for clarity? What are the 04? They're not all, let's do, to take example from the very top line, community resilience initiative, just to do community resilience initiative. What does it give us? So for that particular one, that's a trauma responsive one. That gives us more awareness of how to kind of understand the impact of trauma and how it might play out educationally. And so all those things are ways of looking at those different issues. We're also looking at developmentally what social emotional learning could potentially look. And this, again, we're one of the leaders in the states in this, where we've kind of made the determination. We have social emotional instruction. That's the first explicit instruction that helps students build and repair individual social emotional competencies. Again, that's students and teachers. And some of our professional learning, we're getting used to saying, this goes for students, this goes for staff. Restorative practices. Okay, now you've had some of these skills and competencies. How do you apply them? Well, we apply them to rebuild our community. And so it's that initial skill and knowledge application. So again, to build and repair our local school communities. So now we're doing things like classroom circles. We're doing things like restorative conferences to kind of, and because many times our discipline systems would exclude kids and they come back and they were just kind of labeled as the bad kid. And they never, there was never a good re-enter and reintegration into our school community. Hopefully now we're starting to realize we need to be a lot more intentional about that. And then the last piece there that we kind of moving forward in a very positive, proactive way is, now that we've given you the skills and competencies, you've learned them in your individual self, you apply them to your local school community. Now we put you to go out into the greater wide world. And so how can you use these social emotional competencies to work for greater social justice, and just, again, building that positive school culture in your community, in your state, in your world. And so again, that's an aspirational goal that we have for this program. Now I'm going to make a little switch over, and now I'm going to talk more about our issues with, again, looking at positive school culture. And so one of the big frameworks that we use for this is called PBIS, Positive Interventions and Support. It's a framework that's research-based, that's been around a while. And really it boils down to is that it's really important that we give our students consistent expectations. One of the hats that I wear in our division is I provide behavior support, both for students who might be struggling, helping teachers plan, but also helping some teachers who might be struggling with a particular student or a variety of students. And what I was able to find is that going throughout a school day, I actually got to trail a student at one of our schools as they went from period 1 to period 2 to period all the way through period 8. And the different classroom environments they went into as they went through their academic day varied wildly. And some of them felt warm and accepting and connected, and some felt cold and compliant. And so it's an amazing thing. What we're asking our students to do is to negotiate those different kind of expectations, that one teacher might have this set of expectations, this other teacher may have a completely different set. Realize that that's just putting so much burden on our students. As adults, we can say, we can have a common vision expectations. For school community, we have common practices, we use common language. And in consistency, for many of our students, especially those who've been impacted by trauma, consistency equals safety. It's predictable, it's safe. For many of our students, the more random things are, the more inconsistent they are, it makes them feel unsafe. And then when they feel unsafe, they kind of revert to more fight or flight type things. And we really want to avoid that. Is there a question? I'm on a roll here, but please stop me if you have a question. And so what is PBIS? And so the goals of our way of work for PBIS is, what is our common approach to discipline? Is there a clear set of expectations, behaviors that we expect of all students and teachers, to be frank, and staff? Do we create procedures for teaching those behaviors? So really, discipline should be instructional. It's not a matter of compliance. Like, I told you the rule, I expect you to comply to it. I'm going to assume you don't know it, and I'm going to teach it to you. And so just like I would teach you reading, I'm going to encourage you when I see the behavior I want to do. And again, if what do I do if I see things that are not conducive to the expectations that I've taught you? And then how do I know that again, we're doing the things we need to do as a system, so that ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So something you might have heard, like, oh, PBS is everybody gets stickers. And it's like, no. What PBS is teaching, modeling, practicing, and rewarding appropriate behavior, and having clear and consistent consequences for target behaviors across all classrooms. So what happens in one classroom is consistent with what happens in another classroom. Because again, for many of our students, and I've seen some, we've been very quick to label this student is a behavior problem. Said, yeah, how come they're not a behavior problem in periods 1, 3, and 5, but 2, 4, and 6 they are? It's like, yeah, the student might have some challenges, but there are some things that we're doing as adults that are maybe more successful than others, and we need to acknowledge that. So the idea is, PBIS is not ignoring inappropriate behavior, but getting consistent implementation. So we say, is it okay if it's okay to use cell phones or to use language in one room? It should be a consistent thing across different classrooms as well. So to help do this, we kind of set up school-wide expectations. And so for the elementary, these are ones that have been in place for a long time at our elementaries. And I think many of them are getting ready to revisit these, especially kind of post-pandemic. But there are positively stated expectations that again, we want to make sure that they're not negative. Be respectful, be responsible, be ready. And you can kind of see there's the different ones that the schools have here. They're different because each school is a little different in their culture. And so hopefully they've gone through a process where the students have selected those, or the teachers have, and they've kind of got feedback from the students, they got feedback from the community. Again, we might have done that imperfectly when we first did it a couple of years ago. So as we go into this new cycle, hopefully we're being a lot more intentional about getting family feedback as to, does this make sense for what I want for my student as well? if you have questions about, again, about VTSS and social emotional learning, there's on the Charlottesville City School website, there are certain pages that are set up to kind of go into more detail about what PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports are, and social emotional learning. Some nice videos there, just to kind of give you, again, or if you're trying to explain to a friend or a neighbor, it's like, check out the website. They give you a nice explanation there. Just know that those resources are available to you. As far as some of the things that we're working on with teachers, there are certain practices that if all teachers did, that would solve about 80% of discipline problems. And it's sad to say the research shows this year in, year out. And so just to give you an example, these are some of the professional learning that we're doing with teachers, because we know that all those things on the right-hand side, what make teachers and students successful. And so again, just to give you a little flavor about what is that some of that professional learning might look like. And then the idea with many of our students, families, and teachers, this idea of rethinking discipline. We're thinking this idea of that with academic areas, if student kind of lacks fluency, we say, well, whether they're trying, so we teach them a practice, but with social behavior, we're assuming that, oh, they know how to act, they're just choosing to be wrong. And so either we punish them or we give them incentive saying, I know you know how to do this, so if I give you this kind of carrot at the end of the week, you'll decide to kind of choose your good behavior. And we know that the research shows that that's not really how things work. Ross Green, a great kind of a psychotherapist who's out there, local child psychologist who's out there, he has this great phrase saying, kids behave well if they can. And so are they able to meet the expectations of a given situation? Do they have the skills, and can they apply those skills in this particular context? And if they can't, then we need to kind of support them and teach them so they can, as opposed to the student is choosing to behave in a negative way. Because again, we just know that is not true. The research shows that is not true. One thing that we have to kind of confront kind of historically is that we have this idea of these decodes that we know that Black and brown students are suspended more often. And this is statewide. This is data as about 5 years ago, but it's getting slowly better in our system, but it's not where we need it to be. And we talk about decode offenses, disruption, defiance, disrespect. Well, who gets to define those? Is defiance me, like a student kind of saying that I don't necessarily believe that I should do exactly what you tell me to do for the reasons that you told me that I need to do it for? What is disrespect? And so they're the most subjective, but yes, they're the most common cause of suspension. Now, again, we've gotten a lot better about that. We talk about exclusionary practices. Well, we want to cut down on all those things that take kids out of their classes. So it's not just it's okay not to suspend them, but it does also help while they spend the whole day in the office. That also doesn't help them as well. And so what can we do to make their classrooms feel like a safer, more supportive place for them to be, both for the students and for the teachers? So just if you still kind of have questions going forward, or you want to kind of figure out, like, so again, I'm still not sure how to access all these VTSS supports. So just know that I'm of the division VTS coordinator. Rachel Rasnack is our lead VTS systems coach, which means she works with school teams throughout our division. Bianca Johnson is wearing another hat, and as she's so skilled. She's also one of our systems coaches. And every school has a point of contact that's saying, if I have questions, I should be able to ask for what we call our advanced tier team, or ask for the VTS team. And you should be given the name of a person who could tell you, if you feel like your child is struggling, what are some steps that I can take to kind of get them to start asking the questions, do they need more support? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then I'll be happy to take any kind of questions or just any kind of comments that people might have.